Welcome to this episode of Religion and American Life, a podcast by the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. I am Mark Massa, and I have the happy duty of being director of the Blasey Center, as well as today's podcast host. This podcast is an initiative of the Blasey Center's commitment to connecting a community of scholars, policymakers, media, and religious leaders in conversation and scholarly reflection around issues at the intersection of religion and American public life. Today, we are happy and privileged to have a conversation with Bob Bordone, author of the recently published book, Conflict Resilience: Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In. And today, he will be discussing conflict resilience in a divided church, a very timely topic, I think. Bob is an internationally recognized expert, author, speaker, and teacher in negotiation, conflict resolution, mediation, and facilitation, and recently selected as one of the top 30 negotiation professionals by top global gurus. He served on the full-time faculty at Harvard Law School for more than 20 years as the Thaddeus R. Beal Clinical Professor of Law and director as well as founder of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program before launching his full-time consulting, advising, speaking, and training practice. Bob, welcome.
Mark, thank you so much for having me. It's a real delight to be here.
Bob, why don't we start by you telling us a bit about your own background and your work in conflict resolution and how your career developed around that.
Sure, yeah. So I have spent really my entire professional life in the world of negotiation and conflict resolution. During my time at Harvard Law School, a long time ago, I took a negotiation class and fell in love with the topic. I think for all sorts of reasons. I think partially because it was so interdisciplinary and I'm nothing if not deeply curious. And negotiation brings in behavioral economics and cognitive psychology and social psychology, as well as business and law. But also, I think it was something that really spoke to my values as a Catholic. And I think that's a little bit related to maybe the specific history of the negotiation program at Harvard, which was founded by a number of people, but one of the main people being a guy named Roger Fisher, who wrote a very famous book called Getting to Yes, and who had actually um, interrupted his studies at Harvard to fight in World War II. And when he returned, um, he discovered that all of his roommates had died in the war.
Mm.
And that made him very committed to doing work that would be related to the nonviolent resolution of conflict. And in many respects, the way the program of negotiation, certainly at that time in the 90s, when I was a law student, late 90s, was set up, and I think hopefully continues, but was really seeing violent conflict as a failure of our empathy for the perspective of the other person. And that kind of spoke to me, I think, as a Catholic. I was very blessed. I got to, after a clerkship for a federal judge in Boston for a year, got to come back and start to teach negotiation, and then ultimately founded the Negotiation Mediation Clinical Program, which is really working with students, with clients, and did that all the way up until 2019. And then since then have I continue to teach actually law students, actually at Georgetown a lot of the time, and then in executive education programs at Harvard. But a big part of, or at least a piece of why I decided to do my own work was a real interest around polarization generally, and I think in particular conflict and polarization in faith communities, and in particular as a cradle Catholic in the Catholic Church, and that has led to just getting to do some interesting work in parishes, sometimes with dioceses, sometimes training priests, and then the Paulist Fathers actually have a national initiative on toxic polarization. And so it's been great because I've gotten to work with Jesuits and Paulists and even did some work with Dominicans out in the Midwest. And so it's been a very real blessing and interesting journey, and one that I'm still learning on.
So I know you've dealt with a lot of types of organizations in terms of helping to resolve conflict within them. Would you say that the churches are more conflicted than other groups, or as conflicted, or less conflicted? I mean, as a Catholic and as a presbyter of the Catholic Church, I sense that we are a deeply divided church. Is that typical? Are Catholics more divided than other religious groups? Or
Yeah, I mean, I have no empirical research on this. My sense, my experience is that we are probably about where others are, at least in the U.S. church. Unfortunately, that's not a good place. And one of the things that I often think about is, or you would hope that the Catholic Church would be working to transform culture. And I think one of my worries, right, is that it seems like maybe the culture is more transforming the American Catholic Church. And that strikes me not as a second order challenge, but it should be, I think, a first order concern. And one thing that I find dangerous is that I feel like to the degree this hits on the radar of Catholics as Catholics, it is seen more as second order. And I think that we're missing something really important there because I think that this kind of division is corrosive. From my perspective, it is the way that sin gets into things more. And now, of course, I study negotiation and conflict, so I'm highly aware of all the self-serving biases that might be influencing my view on this. But I think it's worth addressing, right? Centers like yours, other initiatives. How can we say this isn't just like a little thing off to the side, but if this gets roots and grows, right, it is driving us apart, away from the gospel message, away from bringing people to the faith, away from the social justice imperatives that our faith demands of us, and I would just say we're missing the opportunity that conflict well handled can actually give us as a church. On Tuesday, I had the chance to work with pastors in the Archdiocese of Newark, and the title of I didn't actually I was doing a workshop, but I love the director of this priest formation program entitled the program "Healthy Conflict, Healthy Conversations." And I really appreciated that because sometimes I am trying to suggest a change of title where it's something like how to prevent and stop conflict or something.
so in your sense, in your experience of working with various groups, what are some common sources of conflicts within churches? My own sense, I agree with you. My own sense is that most conflict within Catholic communities is not about what we call doctrine. It's rather about cultural and political issues. So gay marriage, gay clergy, abortion, things like that. Is my sense of that your experience as well?
I think so, for sure, right? Some of the same divisive issues. I actually would also add immigration to that. I gave a talk about a month and a half ago at a parish, and someone came up to me afterwards, and she said, "Do you know Father Jim Martin?" I said, "I do." She said, "Oh, I like him. I've liked him very much until he started writing these things about immigration. He's out of his lane on that." And I thought I was very surprised. I was really surprised by this, right? Because I would have thought, I don't know, I would have thought that might have been one of the areas where there had been more joining, and I didn't see that. I would also say, though, and I'd be curious, Mark, your sense of this. I agree with you on the doctrine piece, but I do see some divisiveness around kind of forms of worship, worship styles. So, for example, return of veils, things like adoration and benediction, versus maybe, I don't know, music that will have guitars and drums and a little more contemporary. So I also see that in parish shopping related to that. I don't know if that's been your experience.
Yeah, I think we're at Boston College and St. Ignatius, which is very large and very well-attended church, and I call it it's a destination parish. It offers
Yeah.
different kinds of worships. You have the smells and bells liturgy at 10:30, but you sort of like have the rock liturgy at 5 o'clock for students, and you have the Spanish Mass. So it's very interesting. But my own sense is that most Catholic parishes in the United States don't have the resources that St. Ignatius has, and also doesn't have the clergy because there's like 60 Jesuit priests at Boston College. So St. Ignatius can call on a lot of Jesuit different priests to do different styles of liturgy. My sense is I don't know how a normal pastor, and usually most Catholic parishes in the United States today are pastored by just one priest.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how they have the resources or the time or the energy to do everything they're expected to do. Is that your sense as well?
100%. I mean, I think that my experience of St. Ignatius, even though I go to the Paula Center, I've been to St. Ignatius, is that it's a pretty rare gem in that way. And I could think of a few other parishes I know, but often that are pretty well resourced and quite big that can offer that. But I think more often than not, I think partially because of staffing, and I think partially maybe because of reputation. They kind of end up with and partially because I think of a viewpoint, and this is maybe where the polarization piece comes in, that there is a right way of doing it and or a better way of doing it, as opposed to, at least for me, one of the beauties of being Catholic is the kind of diversity and breadth of worship styles and practices and maybe I'm just fortunate that you know, while maybe on most days I'll take the rock band, I love a rosary. Um, I actually really like benediction. So, and I can appreciate those things. And for me, right, one of the great things about being Catholic is that there's so much in our tradition. And I think one of the things I worry about from a polarization perspective is that there are folks who kind of come in with quite rigid ideas of right or wrong, good or bad, valid or invalid. I was actually at a dinner not so long ago where a priest was saying the first invalid mass I attended was when I was at Fordham University. I felt like, wow, invalid. Like, what happened at that mass? And I don't know, that troubles me.
So, in your sense, what role can theology play in helping to address questions of conflict or divided understandings of what the parish should stand for, how the parish should worship? What what resources might Catholic theology offer to address those kinds of divisions?
Yeah, I'm gonna now you've invited me to tread in waters in which I'm not exactly expert, but since I am a lawyer, that's often not prevents you from saying some things. Anyway, I mean, my sense of this, though, right, and I think this goes directly to good catechesis and good understanding of our faith tradition. But at least from somebody who would be far from saying he is very well educated or especially educated as a Catholic, I guess I would say that I'm probably on my own have done enough independent reading and sourcing of Catholic faith tradition to have a sense, right, that um, our history as a church is filled with so many saints who have had very different ways of praying and worshiping and accessing God. And the more that education could be out there, I think the more helpful it could be. Um, and I think part of the problem is that most of us as Catholics don't have that, I think, particularly well. And so we don't kind of have that ability. Yeah,
Right, as James Joyce said so correctly and memorably, Catholicism means here comes everybody, and it really
comes
is.
everybody.
There's a whole panoply, a whole spectrum of styles of being Catholic. It's
Yeah,
that,
I've been reading. I don't know if you had a chance to read Greg Boyle's Cherished Belonging. So it just came out, and it really tries to address polarization. I'm actually, in fairness, about halfway through. Um, But so much of what he addresses is this kind of challenge that we have of othering other people, right? And that kind of God's capacious love doesn't do that. And that seems like a theological perspective, right?
Right.
Uh, that is a powerful one that I think our faith offers us.
Exactly. Now, you're the expert in this. Could you walk us through the basic principles of conflict resolution that when you walk into a situation, what happens? What do you do first, and then what do you do next, and so forth?
Yeah. So, I think that uh, part of like where our book starts is really pre-conflict resolution, right? It's this idea of conflict resilience, which is actually just having the ability to do something that you mentioned, which is walk in the room. Right? Because if we're afraid to walk in the room because it's going to be uncomfortable or unpleasant, or people might get upset, or might end up get upset, then we can't get to resolution. We can't get to negotiated agreement. We can't get to dialogue. We can't get to anything. I just want to state that because I think that is, first of all, like the premise of what the book is about. But I also think it's a really important piece that we're losing because people are saying, what's the point of going in the room? Uh, I don't like them. We're not going to find anything to agree with. And then when we get polarized, the act of going to the room, if we were going to do it, is perceived by our side as betrayal. So we need to get over that. Now, your question really is about resolution, right? What do you do once you're in the room? And I think the first piece of this is how do we develop a a curiosity that is genuine that will lead to a listening heart. Um, and one of the things that I, struggle with myself, but also struggle with, especially when teaching, is that there are like these behaviors of what listening looks like, and it's important to get the behaviors right. But the behaviors will fall very flat if there's not actually any curiosity. So just the hard work of this is how do we develop curiosity? But the second piece of this, which I think is, I know is of equal importance, and often has gotten, I think, missed in conflict resolution literature, is the speaking up piece. How do we then speak our experience in a way that is non-avoidant, that is authentic, but that also maximizes the chances that the other can hear us, right? So it's not being a battering ram. That's not what we mean here. If you can do that with the other, or sometimes with me, right, sometimes I'm playing the role of a mediator or facilitator. If you can get people to do that, that at worst usually opens up some space for ensuring that instead of demonization, right, there's a we're humanizing each other. We're moving from a flat stereotype to a three-dimensional person. That's like the worst thing I mean, it's like the least good thing that happens, and that's pretty darn good. And more often than not, right, we can at least explore some shared values, be more creative about what some outcomes might look like, right? That's what the kind of resolution is like. And at the most profound level, there's some kind of relational transformation. But one of the things I would say is that even at the lowest level, this act of going in the room, this act of generous listening, this act of being able to a certain authentic way helps prevent the kind of demonization and dehumanization that I think we see just all around us, the kind of dehumanization that allows you just to deport someone without a hearing, or to speak about, your, in your mind, unhinged Uncle Rocco like he is a cartoon character. And chances are he isn't. And chances are the person getting deported without a hearing actually has a story. But if they're non-people because we've already categorized them and we know everything about them, we have no curiosity, then that's like easy to just dispose of and move on.
If you, at the beginning of this process, you walk into the room, and your sense is that the curiosity isn't there or isn't enough to sort of open up a space, do you think at that point the process sort of fails? I mean, can you do conflict resolution without a sense of empathy or openness or inquisitiveness on the other side?
Yeah, such a great question. So maybe this is getting a little like too in the weeds, right? But one of the things that I make a distinction of is conflict resolution from dispute resolution. So a dispute is maybe something like I don't know, where we're going to spend Thanksgiving. That's a dispute. The conflict might be much bigger and deeper around who matters in this relationship. How do we kind of attend to and care for others' needs, right? I think that we could often do dispute resolution without a huge amount of curiosity. Who is responsible for what set of tasks in the office? Who to whom does something belong? Um, um, but that's different from conflict resolution. I think if we're trying to get at things that are maybe more foundational or deeper, I think it's harder to do that without some genuine curiosity and empathy and ability also to assert what's important to you because simply caving in and then you're still left with the side of yourself that feels like I wasn't treated well, I wasn't heard, I'm not seen here. It might look on the surface like things have gotten resolved, but I just think all you've really done is continued the conflict in your sleepless nights. Yeah, so
Exactly. No doubt.
yeah, yeah.
Can you offer an example where conflict resolution strategies help bridge a significant divide?
So, yeah, one of the I was gonna try to tell this in a way that's pretty anonymous. I had a chance to do some work some years ago with two. So this is a diocese that was going through a parish consolidation process, although they had a much
Always,
nicer,
always, always a deeply conflicted moment.
deeply conflicted. They had a nicer name for the program, uh, but it was a parish. As an outside person coming in, I would call it parish consolidation. And there was, two parishes that we were being asked to come together, had very different profiles. One younger Latino, filled with a lot of people, not resource rich financially. The other older, um, of a more European ethnicity, lots of money, not so many people. And part of what we really had to do, and it ended up being a real blessing, right? But really kind of working with the communities on their own first to kind of just name some of the bigger, I would just say, identity-based pain around what the loss would feel like, and why it was important, and the stories, right? There was a lot of kind of listening, and then do some, and in that process, though, we were able to kind of bring people together and share some of those stories, which kind of enabled people to think about what a future could look like, right? And this is in one of these parishes that ends up coming up with a new name. So it's not like Saint, it's either going to be Saint James or Saint Rita, but we're going to come up with something new. We're going to come up with something shared. I mean, it wasn't perfect. It did happen. Not everybody was feeling great about it at the end, but I think it went from what had been a long stalemate to something that felt like there's a future here. And I think what's interesting to me, and I'd be curious, Mark, or if you've been involved in these kinds of things, uh, oftentimes like the way fights happen, people don't discuss what I just talked about. It ends up playing out over like who gets to use the kitchen on a Tuesday night, or who's getting the gym
Right.
or something like that. And because those are easier, and this goes back to dispute and conflict. Those are just I mean, they're not easy, but it's easier to fight about. We've always done this on a Tuesday. Now you're coming in, or you leave it dirty when we come in. And da, 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 like, Father, please fix this. tell them not to do that. But it's hardly ever mostly about that. And if we begin and end it there, and this is where I think, I mean, this is where I think this idea of conflict resilience offers opportunity. Because if we begin and end it there, we actually might miss a really interesting opportunity to actually get at where is the real kind of sadness or pain point or struggle or alienation. And what would it be like as church if we could have that conversation successfully?
Is it
Putting aside that the pastor wouldn't have to decide who gets the kitchen on Tuesday,
right?
there's also the spirit working in that kind of conversation. But if we code conflict as bad and to be avoided, then we're not going to do that. And we're just going to hope Father figures it out, which, by the way, usually ends up being exhausting for Father.
Right. My own sense, and I talk to a lot of parish priests in my role as director of the Blasey Center. My own sense is that Catholic parish priests feel ill-equipped for this by and large, because this is not something that's common. Some seminaries teach this, but it's not a common topic. And so when they walk into a parish, and more often than not, when you're walking into a parish situation, there's conflict going on some level, maybe not a dramatic one, but there's conflict. And so priests who arrive feel ill-equipped to deal with this. What would be your advice to them about how to start dealing with significant divisions or conflict in a parish?
Yeah. So let me just absolutely double click what you say. Just as somebody who, I do a lot of teaching with Leadership Roundtable and their pastor's toolkit. They are ill-equipped, and it is through no fault of their own. But it doesn't mean that they don't have a responsibility to get themselves equipped and not just say, "Oh well, I went to seminary not to do this." It's like that may be true. Now you're a pastor. Now you're an administrator. So I think what I would say, right? Just step one is do the personal work you need to do to have an attitude shift on conflict. Because I do think, I mean, what you asked me earlier, do I think it's better or worse in the Catholic Church? I don't think it's better or worse, but it's different. I think in church communities, and I wouldn't say just the Catholic Church, but in church communities, somehow if there's conflict, there's this coding that someone's been sinful or someone's wrong or something has done and I mean, is that possible? Yes, but the presence of conflict doesn't mean that. So step one, I would just say reframe this in your mind. Step two, right, I would say is take it seriously as an opportunity for real ministry. And part of that is learning more about it. And which, maybe that is taking a class. Maybe that is reading a book or two. Don't just outsource it or pretend it'll just go away. Or, dare I say this, leave it to the next guy. Because I will say some of the biggest challenges that I have seen is conflict deferred to its boiling point, and then some poor new person comes in and is dealing with something that isn't just like in teen mom one, but is like 15 years of neglect, rancor, etc. And so to see it as a ministry opportunity, as an instrument of, healing and grace, and scripture has so many opportunities. The gospel last Sunday, the gospel of the woman caught in adultery. I have a very dear friend who is a newly ordained priest, and his whole homily was on how we see Jesus doing this amazing de-escalation move. He pauses, right? He's writing something in the sand. We don't know
Writing
what
in
it
the sand, there's a lot of books written about what he was
What,
writing.
what was he writing? Yeah, I don't know. This is the theologian question that I'm going to have to opt out on, right? But he pauses. That is a de-escalation move. He asks an open-ended question. He actually is the only person in that scene who asks anything of the woman or even talks to her. Um, and the situation is de-escalated, right? And so just to see, right, that like that he doesn't run away. He doesn't say, I don't know, like hope the next guy handles this one, or it'll work itself out. I would have worked itself out. I don't know if work is the right word. But someone would have, gotten stoned, right? So that would be my kind of quick, maybe that's too long, but my
Sure.
quick piece of advice.
You may have already answered this, but it sounded, is it helpful? Is it more helpful or less helpful to invite somebody in from the outside? Let's say you walk into a parish situation,
Yeah, great,
division.
great question. I'm going to give you a classic, but I think true lawyer's answer on this, which is it depends. I think that the first important thing, right, is it's important to be somewhat diagnostic. Um, my tendency, my sense often is that a pastor can sometimes feel like the responsibility is all on him. And I just think that that's not accurate. Even, even if you have the time, it's not your expertise. There's no shame in bringing somebody in. It's not a sign of your lack of leadership. It's not a sign of your lack of capability. It's the same way you might bring in an accountant. It's the same way, you might bring in any other, maybe I'm sure some pastors mow their own lawns and others get someone to mow the lawn in. There are, just people have different kinds of expertise. So I don't want to say you always need to bring someone in, but I sometimes feel like there's this resistance, this hesitancy, that somehow bringing someone in on something like this is a sign of failure. And I actually think it's just a sign of being smart, just being a sign of being smart.
Interesting. So, what would you say are the possible uses of prayer and spiritual practice in terms of helping to resolve divisions or conflict? Or what have you seen work in your own experience?
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, I have kind of a two-level answer to this, right? Actually, in the moment when you are angry, so I co-wrote this book with a neurologist, and a piece of what's in there is brain science. And one of the pieces of uh, evidence-based brain science is the power of a pause. Um, Actually, the pause gives us this moment to reduce what's called the limbic irritability, where the amygdala, our emotional center, has taken over, and returned us back to kind of the frontal lobe, the more cognitive part. The prayer piece of this, I think for Catholic Christians, is literally a pause. Like for me, I have a devotion to the Blessed Virgin. Just like, please help me, Our Lady. Like literally something like that. That's like the in the moment piece, right? And I think having some kind of very quick prayer, right, can help us pause and just respond in a more mindful way. I think then there's the longer part of this, which I think is closer to kind of a discernment. If there's something that has been weighing heavy on your heart, should I raise this and should I not raise this? And what are the pros and what are the cons, right? To just kind of bring that in prayer as part of the discernment. I think sometimes we have these tendencies to silence the piece that might feel selfish or uncertain. And I think prayer can help us give voices to those things and then give us actually a prayer for some courage. Our book talks about what does it mean to be brave, and that act of putting yourself forward, both in listening and in speaking, does require, courage, which is a gift of the spirit. And so asking for that, I think, can be helpful.
So praying and asking for specific kind of gifts is is helpful and maybe decisive for resolving these things.
Amen. I totally believe that. Yeah, I totally believe that.
So, what do you think are what's the most important lesson that churches can learn about conflict resolution?
Yeah. Oof. I would say a few things, right? I know you only asked me for one, but
No, you can give as many as you want.
okay, good. Yeah. So first, just again, this reframing of the idea of conflict as the spirit at work in this community. So when you try to shove it out the door, it's like saying, we don't want this, the way the Spirit works in this way. And the history of the church, I think, has shown that like conflict can be generative. I mean, second, I think, is that um, wherever you are on this, ranging from, I would rather have, boiled broccoli with no salt or anything on it for the rest of my life than have a single conflict, to, I think I'm pretty good at it. We all can get better. And what that requires is some prayer around it, some self-reflection, some honesty in where are our strengths and where are our fears in this. And then some willingness to just learn more about what conflict offers and how to do it better, right? So that's, I think, the second big piece that I would say on this. Um, and then the last thing I would just say is that so much of the time in my experience, I mean, this is not empirical, research based, it is experience based. But the fear of and anxiety of what a hard conversation or series of conversations might be almost always is worse than the actual conversation. And there's something liberating about doing it. I'll just give you a very quick example. Not so long ago, I was involved in a board situation, and there was somebody involved that I think many people felt like it was time for this person to move on. I was in that number. That person came to me and asked me my view on it. This was not comfortable. Um, and I had to tell the person, I didn't have to do anything. I chose to hopefully with kindness and gentleness and compassion, I told them what I thought. Um, it kept me up the night before. It wasn't great. I have a sense of freedom about that. I know that I have not said anything to anyone else that I didn't say to that person. That's pretty liberating. And I hope I did. I mean, I don't know if I did it I don't think I did it perfect, don't get me wrong. Um, but there's something in that for us to, I think, hold on to as church. And I think sometimes, we don't do that so well, right? Again, we hope someone else will handle it. We pass it along. We hope it'll disappear.
I'm just curious, what was the response on the part of the person you spoke with?
No agreement, disagreement. I think some hurt. Um, I think some appreciation, but not that much appreciation. I'll be honest, not that much appreciation. In a way, right? I think for me, it was like, well, there's not going to be a rumor mill on this. There's no rumor, at least with respect to me. There's no rumor, and it enabled me to say so many ways in which this person, I think, has contributed.
Thank you, Bob Bordone. This has been very enlightening. To my audience, I would say God loves you, but God will love you more if you buy Bob's book called Conflict, Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
Thank you for listening to Religion and American Life, a podcast by the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. For more information on the work of the Blasey Center, the center's schedule of events, or to listen to other episodes of this podcast, please visit our website at bc.edu/BOISI.